Nations now, where the General Assembly is marking Nelson Mandela International Day. Let's take you there live now.
These are universal values set out in the Charter of the United Nations and human rights treaties. Here in the United Nations General Assembly, we are tasked with upholding and protecting these values. It is thus only right that we convene here today to celebrate, promote these ideals, and to honor Nelson Mandela. I avail of this opportunity to commend the Republic of South Africa and the people of South Africa, who had to overcome centuries of racial subjugation and continue to strive for a world of equality, defined by solidarity rather than difference, respect and hope rather than distrust. Nelson Mandela's name is synonymous with the fight for justice and equality. Many of us here today and around the world learned of his actions on our radios, television sets, and in the newspapers. We heard of this great champion for equality who would not accept injustice, poverty, or discrimination. He had the vision to imagine a better world for all. We must remember this today when we consider the plight of the 82.4 million people worldwide who have been forcibly displaced. When we think of the women and girls subjected to sexual and gender-based violence. When we pledge to leave no one behind and reach the furthest behind first. We must uphold Mandela's legacy of racial reconciliation, especially as intolerance and racial discrimination are threatening to erode the progress which he himself fought so hard to advance. As an international community, we must take collective action, for we will not achieve the targets of the 2030 Agenda whilst racism and discrimination persist. Tomorrow I will convene a midterm review of the International Decade for People of African Descent. This informal meeting will seek to review the situation as set out by the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action. Excellencies, dear colleagues, this past year has been extraordinarily difficult. On an individual level and as countries, we have all suffered. The COVID-19 pandemic has taken souls from this earth all too soon. It has put our health systems under immense strain and created a socio-economic crisis like no other. This crisis has hijacked our development trajectory, hitting the most vulnerable countries the hardest. Now, as we seek to recover, I hope that we will continue to stand together as nations united. For no country can emerge from this pandemic unscathed. We have pledged to leave no one behind, and we cannot renege upon that promise all this time of crisis. The most vulnerable must be placed at the fore of all our efforts. We must galvanize multilateral efforts to achieve fair and equitable access to vaccines for all. We must uphold the human rights of everyone, everywhere. Allow me to conclude with the words of Madiba. Thus shall we live, because we will have created a society which recognizes that all people are born equal, which each entitled in equal measure of life, liberty, prosperity, human rights, and good governance. Put simply, we must act in the spirit of Madiba if we are to build back better. I thank you. I now give the floor to the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Her Excellency Amina Mohammed, to deliver a statement.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear friends, I am pleased to be with you today and to represent the Secretary General as we celebrate Nelson Mandela International Day. Today would have been the 102nd birthday of this extraordinary man who embodied the highest aspirations of the United Nations and the human family. Nelson Mandela exemplified courage, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to social justice and equality. He led the struggle to end the racist apartheid system in his native South Africa and continued to fight against injustice throughout his life. Madiba's calls for solidarity and an end to racism are particularly relevant today as social cohesion around the world is threatened by division. Hate speech and the denial of facts are moving to the mainstream in liberal democracies and authoritarian regimes alike, blurring the truth, questioning science, and undermining democratic institutions. We have seen the alarming trend of people with little or no knowledge of historical facts being infected by the virus of disinformation and distortion, and embracing violent ideologies. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has made these ills more acute, while also rolling back years of progress in the global fight against poverty and injustice. As always in times of crisis, it is the marginalized and already discriminated against who suffer the most, often while being blamed for problems they did not cause. People of African descent, people of Asian and Pacific Islander descent, indigenous peoples, ethnic or religious groups and minorities, people who had to flee their homes as refugees, they bear the brunt of racism, xenophobia, and related intolerance. These are the ills that Nelson Mandela stood up against to create his lasting legacy. In September 2018, at the Nelson Mandela Peace Summit held in the United Nations headquarters, nearly 100 representatives of government and civil society committed to redoubling efforts to build a just, peaceful, prosperous, inclusive, and a fair world. The gathering declared the years 2019 to 2028 as the Nelson Mandela Decade of Peace. It is our individual responsibility to follow Madiba's example of humility, of forgiveness and compassion, while advocating for democracy and peace throughout the world. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown us the vital importance of human solidarity and unity, values championed and exemplified by Madiba in his lifelong fight for justice. Recurring waves of infection across continents make it clear that no one is safe until all are safe, and each of us has a part to play. As we enter the third year of the Nelson Mandela Decade of Peace, let us be inspired by Madiba's message that each of us can make a difference in promoting peace, human rights, harmony with nature, and above all, dignity for all. If I may add a personal note, Madiba has been an inspiration for me ever since I was a young person trying to find my path in life. I have taken to heart his profound words that there can be no greater gift than that of giving one's time and energy to helping others without expecting anything in return. As we reflect on Madiba's life and work, let us each stand up and be counted. Let us borrow a leaf from his stubborn optimism in the human endeavor. Let us all honor his call and be energized by his legacy. I thank you.
I thank the Deputy Secretary General for her statement. I now invite the Assembly to view the pre-recorded keynote statement of Her Excellency Naledi Pandor, Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of South Africa.
Your Excellency, Mr. Volkan Bozkır, President of the General Assembly, Your Excellency, Secretary General Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, distinguished Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends. On behalf of the Government of the Republic of South Africa and His Excellency President Cyril Ramaphosa, it is an honor for me to be with you today, even though virtually, to mark this auspicious occasion, the Nelson Mandela International Day. This is 103 years since the birth of our late beloved global icon and the first president of our democratic republic, Dr. Nelson Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela. That the United Nations General Assembly deemed it important to establish this day not only attest to the enduring legacy which Nelson Mandela bequeathed humanity, but it is also an affirmation of our common humanity, in defense of which President Mandela, our leader, sacrificed 27 years in jail. I convey to you South Africa's most profound gratitude to the United Nations for its commitment to the advancement of Nelson Mandela's values and ideals. The theme chosen for this year is very important, speaking as it does to the first and second goals of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are ending poverty and achieving zero hunger. And of course, key to these is saving lives first, in accordance with the third goal on health. Mr. President, in his well-known autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, Nelson Mandela reminds us that he was born in a year in which humanity faced challenges similar to the current challenges that the world is confronted by, specifically that of the COVID-19 pandemic. He remarks, and I quote, "The year of my birth marked the end of the Great War, the outbreak of an influenza pandemic that kills millions throughout the world. Were he alive today, having been born in the midst of such challenges and into a life of struggle that was given momentum by global solidarity, he would most certainly urge us as humanity to rise together in solidarity to save the lives of all, everywhere, because none of us are safe until all are safe." A firm believer in strong and effective multilateralism, with the United Nations at the forefront, undergirded by the equality of nations, Nelson Mandela would have stressed the importance of all nations rising and working together, sharing ideas, the means, and all the tools required for ending this vicious pandemic, which knows no boundaries. Central to this is equitable, secure, predictable, and affordable access in real time to vaccines and all the tools which nations require to respond to the pandemic. Mr. President, it would have been a matter of grave concern to President Nelson Mandela that as I'm addressing this gathering on a day designated to mark his legacy, our continent, Africa, the second most populous continent in the world, with more than 1.3 billion people, is the last in line to have access to vaccines, while the richest countries are well advanced in vaccinating their people, while at the same time hoarding vast reserves of doses of vaccines, even as they deny developing countries the capacity to produce vaccines. This is the type of injustice that would have been intolerable to President Mandela. We owe it to his legacy to vigorously demand and achieve universal access to vaccines now. Mr. President, as a practical expression of the values that Nelson Mandela stood and fought for, we hope member states of the United Nations will join and support our President, His Excellency Cyril Ramaphosa, the COVID-19 champion of the African Union, and also co-chair of the Act A Facilitation Council, in his urgent call to end vaccine nationalism and indeed vaccine apartheid. Nelson Mandela would have been at the front line of the campaign of the African Union and the developing world for an urgent waiver of the WTO TRIPS agreement to ensure the rapid upscaling of the production of COVID-19 vaccines, of medicines, and of the sharing of technologies needed to end the pandemic and save lives. While natural instinct to protect the interests and mega profit margins of a few may tell us that it is impossible to act in the interests of all humanity, I remind you, as Nelson Mandela said, that it always seems impossible until it is done. That is how apartheid was defeated in South Africa, in the face of seemingly indomitable might. Mr. President, we are now 1 year into the decade of action on the promise made by our leaders when they adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals, which embodies our shared vision to end poverty, address unemployment and income inequalities within and between countries. Data coming out on the impact of the pandemic tells us that developing countries have lost at least 2 decades of development. Literally, for many developing countries, they're at ground zero, if not back to where they were toward the end of the last century and millennium with respect to the MDGs. Towards the end of his life, the question of poverty eradication was uppermost in Nelson Mandela's concerns, and in his words, he urged us to address this because, as he said, as long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality persist in our world, none of us can truly rest. As we meet today to mark Nelson Mandela's life, we must commit to spare no effort in ensuring that the progress lost in attaining the SDGs because of the pandemic is recovered speedily, so that as we build back better, truly no one is left behind, particularly with regard to food security. Key to this are all the means of implementation necessary for an integrated approach to the SDGs in their interdependence and indivisibility as a package of human rights. Our interdependence as economies means that we either come out of the pandemic by building back better together, or we scramble individually in a survival of the fittest mode to the detriment of sustained and inclusive global growth, which is absolutely necessary for the eradication of poverty and hunger, our ambition. The collective effort required to this end may seem daunting, but always recall, it always seems impossible until it is done. Mr. President, while the influenza pandemic of 1918 and COVID-19 have in common serious life-threatening challenges, they both fell upon an old pandemic, which is equally deadly, which has yet to be fully and effectively addressed. And that is the pandemic of systemic racism. As we work together to respond to COVID-19, we must also redouble our efforts to combat systemic racism globally. It has severely complicated our response to the pandemic. The victims of systemic racism have been hit hard by COVID-19, with a heavy burden imposed by loss of lives that could have been saved. We urgently need collective action based on previously agreed outcomes. As you would recall, the United Nations World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance held in South Africa in September 2001, took place just after President Mandela retired from public office. However, in spite of his retirement, former President Mandela retained a keen interest in the outcomes of this conference, as he had spent 27 years of life in prison for challenging white supremacism and the apartheid regime. Hence, as part of the outcomes of the World Conference Against Racism, our former president and the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, co-signed a visionary declaration entitled Tolerance and Diversity, a vision for the 21st century. More than 70 heads of state and government signed on to this declaration, which opened with absolutely apt words today. It stated, "As a new century begins, we believe each society needs to ask itself certain questions. Is it sufficiently inclusive? Is it non-discriminatory? Are its norms of behavior based on the principles enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Racism, racial discrimination," it continued, "xenophobia, and all kinds of related intolerance have not gone away. We recognize that they persist in the new century, and that their persistence is rooted in fear. Fear of what is different, fear of the other, fear of the loss of personal security. And while we recognize that human fear in itself is ineradicable, we maintain that its consequences are not ineradicable." Mr. President, this year marks the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the Durban Declaration and its program of action. We welcome the decision of the General Assembly to hold a one-day high-level meeting to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Durban Declaration in September in New York on the theme Reparations, Racial Justice and Equality for People of African Descent. The Declaration is the most comprehensive program for combating racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Nelson Mandela made huge personal sacrifices in his lifelong commitment to fighting racism and discrimination. It therefore goes without saying that the biggest tribute we, as this international community, can afford him in this regard is to ensure continued international commitment to and implementation of the Durban Declaration Program of Action, so that we may rid our minds, our attitudes, our communities, and our world of the scourge of racism and all its manifestations. Mr. President, in conclusion, systemic racism has had a pernicious effect on many communities and compounded the impact of the pandemic on its victims. In addressing the issue of security and predictability of the supply of vaccines, at the core of which is the waiver we demand, addressing racism is also critical. When former President of the United States, Barack Obama, delivered the 2018 Nelson Mandela Annual Lecture, he said that Mandela understood the ties that bind the human spirit. He further went on to say that there is a word in South Africa, Ubuntu, that describes his greatest gift, his recognition that we are all bound together in ways that can be invisible to the eye, that there is a oneness to humanity, that we achieve ourselves by sharing ourselves with others and caring for those around us, As we say, umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu, or I am because you are. This is how we describe the meaning of Ubuntu. It speaks to the fact that we are all connected and that one can only grow and progress through the growth and progression of others. Ubuntu has since been used as a reminder for society on how we should be treating others. For us, Ubuntu, in the words of President Mandela, mean to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. We cannot agree more with Dr. Tedros, the Director General of the World Health Organization, when he says, the pandemic is not over anywhere until it is over everywhere. None of us are safe until all are safe. Mr. President, once more I thank you for this opportunity.
I thank the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of South Africa for her keynote speech.
All right, Minister of International Relations, Naledi Pandor, there speaking on behalf of South Africa to the UN General Assembly as they mark International Nelson Mandela Day. All right, well, let's take a short break. We'll bring you more news after this. Do stay with us.